Okay, so I wanted to make a video for the security practitioners, but also organizations at large that are trying to understand or wrap their head around how can our organization use generative AI meaningfully to gain some of the efficiencies needed for your organization, wherever that looks like, right? But I wanted to demystify some of the assumptions made with Microsoft Copilot, just general confusion, things like that. Hopefully, I can clear up some stuff, but also what we're looking at from the security lens, right? What should your organization consider before adopting any type of generative AI? So I'll put some links down in the description box that hopefully continue the conversation but help out your organization navigate some of these decisions that they're likely facing in the next 12 months to about a year as organizations are adopting some form of AI quickly, right? So I'm back on my drawing board, and as you can see, I have a couple items, right? Mainly, I have our, well, now what is known. We'll work with what we got. So we have these relationships that are already tied with your data, right? And where does your data reside? So I want to dispel the myth that you don't have access, even though it's a SaaS application, right? Microsoft 365, and let me zoom in to show what I'm seeing. 365 tenant is similar to Microsoft Azure subscriptions. So obviously this is a SaaS offering to you as an organization, whether you're under an enterprise agreement, some type of agreement that entitles you to acquire the licenses that you do day-to-day operations. Plainly speaking, okay? So the understanding of the shared responsibility model, right, is Microsoft is providing the service as a SaaS service on top of existing, right, M365 subscriptions. So how does that really break down, right? Well, essentially what Microsoft did, or what M365 Copilot follows, is using your information as the Graph API. That's where all its intelligence is at. So you want to think of the Graph API, and I don't know if I have a logo. Yeah, this looks like it. You want to think of the Graph API having all your information, right? Now the Graph API is going to have a number of things. It's going to have the roles, the context of your data and your information. Okay? Now what that does is it allows the service to essentially run as a intelligent kind of, think of this as that retrieval augmented generation, right? So this is what is powering your areas of using your chats, your emails, things of that nature, right? Now this same visual, even though I know it's not too pretty, right? This does extend to all your data that relates to that's stored inside the various mediums, right? So it's likely you have some data stored if you're an M365 shop, right? Maybe in OneDrive. If you have data stored as far as like a SharePoint site, maybe you don't use those, right? But these are the ways to think about where the true value is really going to be unlocked. It's going to be using some of that first party integration. Not to dismiss that, hey, there is a lot of third parties, right, that you can think of in this space as well. But at the same time, currently, the Graph API is providing that access. Now, of course, there's going to be the questions, okay, my organization has a Slack or perhaps some type of other communication medium, and I'm just going through my right side to see if I have an ad for this, but let me see if I can get us a logo to represent some of that third party, because I want to touch on that too. So this looks like a nice one to add. Okay. So this gives me Slack, right? So this will be living outside of our external information. And the way you want to think about this is the entrance, or where you typically have some type of response that's retrieving any information related to M365, right, is typically going to reside in this Graph API. The reason being is that's really what powers the backbone of most of the operations that are abstracted to you as the user, right? But the Graph API makes more of your relations, your roles, job titles, things like that. This will house a lot of that intelligence. Now, when you want to extend M365 Copilot, right, when we're thinking about how does that look, right? You want to think about what are the permissions that I have that I'm allowing Slack to retrieve, right? Perhaps I'm allowing it obviously to have a username. Perhaps I'm using a user email, right? But what other type of permissions am I giving it? So these are the conversations you want to start thinking about long term, right, as your organization's adopting this. And then some key areas that I see commonly, right? Specifically with SharePoint. So there's this semantic index, and I'll probably, let me see if I have a visual to break it down for you. All these resources are publicly available, right? So we have our Graph API. This is a better visual, right? We can see that it has our teams, our tasks, essentially context about what our day-to-day operations look like from the user perspective, right? But also the organization. And then you want to see how that feeds down the chain, right? So obviously OneDrive's used for your users to share files, recordings, etc. Exchange online predominantly through email communications medium, and then you have Teams and some other SharePoint, right? Now, obviously, this is showing, it's going to show the first party stuff because it's really built on the integration of accessing that Graph API. And that's really where the service boundary and all those protections come in. So you have to think of this as if you are adopting a AI technology today, right? Let's say that is not necessarily M365 Copilot, but something similar, right? Because you're likely going to have these conversations with your CISO, CTO, things like that. So let's just categorize it as generative AI SaaS in some shape or form, right? Whether that's GitHub Copilot, that's still Microsoft, but whether that's Google Bard or whatever that looks like. These are the things that you're going to have to start thinking about from the security aspect, right? Where does the data reside, right? Is it a isolated tenant that is location dependent where that located SaaS operation is? Do they disclose where that area is, right? So you want to think about data residency. Where does the data live? And let's say the application itself will say, okay, you can bring your own connections and we'll do the rest, right? So then you have to think, most of the time, it has to retrieve, right, the information that is needed to produce meaningful outputs, right? Better tuning. Let's just go with that, okay? So for that to happen, we have to pull our data from somewhere. Now, where is that specific medium? What are the controls they have? These are the things you have to think about. Where is it stored? Are prompts stored? How is it used to train the model? These are some things that are going to start provoking those conversations with your team and hopefully wider audience of the executives that are aware of, okay, data residency is definitely a thought. Do you operate in international borders? Is there something, regulation of your data, right? And there's some solutions out there already that are FedRAMP approved and doing some more faster, I would say, innovation in this space. So this is not to like diminish any of the value of that, okay? Another thing is how are the permissions assigned, right? Assigned. What system are they using, right? These are going to be some more of your due diligence. But the reason I bring all this up is because if you're going to have these conversations about, hey, where does our organization look like with adopting some of the bleeding edge technology, right? The value proposition of these copilots, LLMs inside a productivity suite, right? Google's doing, I believe, Do It AI. M365 obviously has Copilot. You want to think of this as the context that your organization already has, right, inside the ecosystem. So if you're not necessarily leveraging Microsoft today, but it's something in the future of that suite, that's going to be where the value is going to be at for M365 Copilot, right? Now there's going to be Copilot Studio, and I'll cover what Copilot Studio is too in this video to, break down some of the different areas. So the area that I just showed, right, in reference, this document here goes over the semantic index, and then similarly when I was talking about that service boundary. So you want to think about that service boundary as a software as a service, right? We, Microsoft, or the Microsoft, not me, is responsible for the services they provide, right? You want to think about SLAs, your agreement, the uptime of the resources that are needed for your business, right? So if anything leaves that service boundary, such as extending to a additional third-party connector, API, things like that, that's going to be requiring a little bit more closely due diligence. Not to say that you don't already do that through M365, but those are going to be some of the things you want to start looking at as well, because it's likely you use multiple vendors, right? And I want you to get the value out of anything, but also know where it's at, right? So what are the other areas with semantic index, right? So this gives you a good description of breaking up the keyword matching, personalization, and social matching capabilities, right? So you want to think about this as we're already used to using a keyword search in Google, right? If we're searching for a specific topic, show me examples of something, right? Now, some of it, depending how you query, could get better results. So what this does in the back end is this makes specific relationships based on its understanding of your data, right? Now, again, this will tell you how that kind of breaks down under the hood with this visual, but you also want to be aware of what type of documents are actually being enabled, at least as of today, right, publicly. So this will tell you what is indexed, right? Now, perhaps you do have some SharePoint sites, right? These could be team indexes, stuff that was abandoned, whatever the case may be. You can obviously exclude some of those SharePoint sites from being indexed by the search or semantic index, right? So we give you that option as well, along with some areas of training that can kind of help with that. So really, when you want to think about what breaks down next, right? So you have the Copilot itself that will sit in the M365 suite, right, isolated. Now you want to think of if you're using Azure OpenAI already, you're using an API as a service, right? For a specific amount of queries, things like that, that you're leveraging or building your own model with, right? That's essentially what the back end of Copilot M365 is. So that it keeps it essentially, you want to think about it conceptually, every specific Copilot is going to have its own type of AI service in the back end. Now, I hope that breaks down at least some parts of it. A lot of people I know, when I try to go through this conceptually, some people are following, some people aren't. But nonetheless, what are some of the things you can do today? And I don't think this is vocalized enough, is even if you're at E3 specifically, this gives you actionable, quick insights and a nice visual too for your team to realize, okay, what should we consider today, right? And I look at this as you want to think about it agnostically. You probably have information residing on, local disk drives, Windows file servers, file shares, other things like that, right? Perhaps that's outside of M365, but you also want to think about what are the protections, regardless if it can, extend to a specific API, such as 365, Slack, etc. But these are really good best practices as well. This also breaks out specifically at a high level how to configure teams, set up external collaboration. Some of the more visuals here kind of go through what we look at for enrolling and pushing out Copilot to your organization. Now, every organization's at different steps when it comes to zero trust, right? Some organizations are a little bit behind. Some organizations are more mature in that regard, right? So we've also put together a documentation here that really helps kind of guide those conversations along with the visual as well. But you can also see at a high level, it's going to touch on what we cover for adopting M365 Copilot. And a lot of these as well, you can even see at we specifically say if you're not using any of the protections described above, right, take the time to pilot them prior to assigning Copilot licenses. So that's very explicit what we're saying as well, right? You want to make sure you have these secure foundations before you take advantage of these services, because you want to think about that security as well, right? So I hope that demystifies some of those areas here. Primarily, I won't cover the prompting specifically, but you want to think about, I've used M365 Copilot before, but you want to think similar to your experience with GPT-4 on OpenAI's, right? The more specific your prompt is, the better the results, right? So if I say, generate me a report based on, and to include files that you have, right? You can just do a backslash, and typically a drop down will populate what files you want, right? Let's say audit XLS, Excel spreadsheet, right? Pretty familiar lingo should be to most. Generate me a report based on audit. Show me the top 5 areas our organization needs to focus on, right? Now, of course, this is me just brainstorming the top of my head, but if you can see, I'm telling it to do an action, I'm giving it some type of context to work with, and then I'm saying, okay, I want the top 5 areas of our organization need to focus on, right? Now, this is very generic, okay? These get a lot better with what I'd say a little bit of art added to it, right? So the way you want to think about your prompt in general is you want to give it a sort of action, right? Generate, summarize, do something that deals with a action related to the word itself, right? But also to the statement at large. Whether that's, write me a report on the top 5 AI risk in cybersecurity as of, 2023, something of that nature. And I just relate it back to things that I would use this service for, right? Additionally, you want to think about how would it be used in Power BI. I used some of the early versions of it, and it's really powerful if you already clean your data, right? You want to think when you're actually starting to visualize it. If you prompt it specifically, use row, let's say prices, and column B for zip codes based on the last 12 months of data. What is the deviation? Show me a KPI chart with this. Something of that nature, right? And I'm just referencing at the top of the head, so please no judgment. But you will get a pretty good report. And the best part about it is, even if you're not necessarily a designer or let's say a prompt engineer per se, someone that does this every day, you can take advantage of a lot of the native capabilities that are already familiar to you fairly quickly. So if you go to like bing.com, as I'll show here, you should see our Copilot logo, right? If I go to Bing Chat, this will open up Bing Chat, or should perhaps, since I'm in Chrome, I might get a different experience. Okay, so you can see right here I have Copilot with Bing Chat, right? This was already publicly available, but just to show you, this looks very similar on the M365 license side, right? And then to the right, if you wanted to use similar like designer, vacation planner, cooking assistant, etc., you can dive into that. So let's say you just want to try it out, see what's the kind of uses as your organization is trying to think about those decisions, right? Now, of course, don't use sensitive information in some form like this. You want to limit any of those conversations with things that are free in general as a good practice. And then on top of that, you want to think about, what does this mean long term, right? I could see data protection for organizations substantially grow, or the visibility of that, because there's likely going to be quite a lot of information generated. Perhaps it's inaccurate, or there needs to be a source of truth, right, mapped to some stuff. I think for any organization to get the most out of tools like this is really going to be dependent on using RAG. Similarly, retrieval augmented generation, right? And that's just really having a solid reference point, but a large reference point. So you want to think about data lakes in general that I could see potentially being part of better offerings that will bring most data in from all types of data, right? But you also want to think about what are the protections that are we going to do, regardless if that's in Microsoft or outside of Microsoft. If that data resides in some type of OneDrive, right, your service is likely going to touch some type of API. So these are things that I'm seeing as this popularity of large language models are starting to be adopted widely, right? Now, I still think we're in some of the earliest stages, right? This is fairly new. It went GA like back in November, but I did want to break down, at least in a video, some of the key areas and hopefully give you some resources to help you out. Think about zero trust broadly as your organization is adopting this technology, because a lot of organizations really want this use, but I think you have to also be vocalized, okay, are we ready, right? And a lot of this is very watered down or straight to the point, right? So if you have an E3 license, this will go through what you can use for that. And then specifically, the main difference when you want to think about data tagging or data classification, right? If that's something you would want to consider, that's really the biggest difference between that E3, E5. So just as a precaution, right? If you're doing that with another vendor, they likely have something probably similar that could do that as well. So anyways, I just wanted to make a quick video. Hopefully that clears up a lot of stuff. Hopefully you found this useful. Until next time.